The gray morning light of late 1944 seeped through the cracked windows of the Luftwaffe hangar, spreading across the oil-stained floor like a reluctant dawn, unwilling to wake the tired souls within. The war had dragged on longer than anyone had dared to imagine, and yet inside this massive steel-ribbed skeleton of metal and echo, the air still smelled of confidence, or at least of men pretending to have it. Mechanics moved like ghosts under the wings of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, their tools clinking softly, their faces streaked with the black fingerprints of war. And in the center of this organized chaos stood Oberleutnant Karl Weiss, the pride of Jagdgeschwader 54. A man whose blue eyes carried the cold arrogance of a hawk and whose flight jacket bore the silent testimony of dozens of kills stitched proudly across its chest. He stood with a cigarette hanging loosely from his lips, one hand in his pocket, the other pointing lazily toward the object that had just been towed in through the hangar doors. A captured American fighter, the P-47 Thunderbolt, its massive frame gleaming under the half-light like some wounded animal dragged before its hunter. The crew had found it downed near the Ardennes, the pilot dead, the aircraft largely intact. For the Germans, it was an opportunity to study the enemy's machine. For Karl Weiss, it was something else entirely. A joke. He tilted his head, exhaling smoke in a sharp, dismissive laugh that echoed across the hangar rafters, drawing the attention of his comrades. "So this," he sneered in German, voice dripping with amusement, "is what the Americans send against us? This overweight cow of aluminum?" The men laughed, eager to mirror their ace, their hero. The mechanics paused their work to watch him circle the Thunderbolt like a predator circling prey already dead. His boots clacked against the concrete as he paced, his laughter building. "Look at it! It's a flying barn door! Heavy, slow, clumsy. No wonder its pilot couldn't keep up. My Focke-Wulf would dance around this beast before it could even blink." His laughter grew louder, infectious in a grim sort of way, breaking through the heaviness that hung in the air. For a moment, even the men who secretly feared the turning tide of war forgot about fuel shortages, lost friends, and nightly bombings. For a moment, they had their ace, their unshakable Karl Weiss, mocking the might of the Allied sky, and it made them feel immortal again. But inside that laughter was something else, something not even Weiss could recognize. Beneath the arrogance, beneath the steel-hard pride of a German fighter ace, there was exhaustion and perhaps even fear. For he had seen the sky changing. He had watched, week after week, the Luftwaffe bleed, aces shot down, airfields bombed, fuel running dry. He had watched the Americans come not in twos or tens, but in hundreds, endless silver swarms across the gray heavens. Yet pride demanded denial. Pride demanded laughter. So he laughed louder, mocking the thick fuselage of the Thunderbolt, slapping its side as if to challenge the machine itself. Too big to fight, too slow to run. The Americans think they can buy victory by adding weight to their wings. The men roared again. The hangar became a small stage, and Weiss its actor, performing confidence for the benefit of morale. Even his commanding officer, Major Kruger, cracked a rare smile, watching his star pilot turn derision into courage. Weiss climbed onto the wing of the P-47, inspecting the cockpit, its broad instrument panel, foreign and over-engineered to his eye. "This is what they fly," he said, gesturing to the cluster of gauges. "Machines built by engineers who have never seen war. Everything large, everything American." He spat to the floor. "Give me the simplicity of a Messerschmitt any day. This is a symbol of their arrogance." He didn't know then that arrogance mirrors itself, that in laughing at the enemy's creation, He was staring into his own reflection. The laughter grew louder still, until it almost drowned out the dull whine of an approaching truck outside. The hangar door creaked open again, and another group of pilots entered. Fresh replacements, barely out of flight school, boys with hollow eyes. They watched Weiss with something between admiration and unease, for they had heard his name whispered like legend. He was the man who had downed 27 Allied aircraft, the man who had faced Mustangs and Spitfires and returned unscathed. To them, he was what Germany still claimed to be, unbroken. And yet one of the young pilots, Lieutenant Franz Becker, found himself staring at the captured Thunderbolt not with disdain, but with curiosity. He had heard stories of its toughness, its power dive, how it could take hits that would tear a 109 apart. But he said nothing, not yet. Weiss jumped down from the wing, landing with a thud. His cigarette had burned to a stub. He crushed it beneath his boot. "Remember this, boys," he said, addressing the newcomers. "When you see this beast in the sky, don't fear it. It can't turn like we can. It can't climb like we can. It's only good for running home once it realizes it's outmatched. And its pilots, they're spoiled. They fight with numbers, not skill." His words filled the hangar like sermon, and his grin was sharp. Yet as he turned away, his eyes met Becker's, the only one not laughing. "You don't agree, Lieutenant?" Weiss asked, his tone suddenly colder. The boy straightened, caught between honesty and survival. "I just heard, sir," he softly began. "They say the Thunderbolt can take incredible punishment, that its radial engine keeps it flying even when it's hit." Weiss chuckled darkly. "So can a cow keep walking after it's been shot in the leg. Doesn't mean it's dangerous." The laughter returned, but Becker's uncertainty lingered in the air like smoke. Later that evening, when most of the men had gone, the hangar quieted. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a blood-red glow that bled through the windows. Weiss remained pacing near the captured P-47. He couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps curiosity had taken root despite his mockery. He climbed once more into the cockpit, running his fingers over the controls. It was cramped, yet solid, built like a tank, every switch purposeful. He noticed the thickness of the glass canopy, the weight of the armored plating behind the pilot's seat. "Ridiculous," he muttered, but part of him understood. This wasn't built for elegance. It was built for survival. He sat there for a while, silent, surrounded by the lingering echoes of his laughter. Then from the far end of the hangar, Becker approached quietly, hesitant to interrupt. "Sir," he began softly, "do you think maybe the Americans build this way because they can afford to? They don't care about fuel or weight. They have more of everything." Weiss didn't answer right away. His hand rested on the throttle. He thought of the last mission, of his wingman shot down by a formation of P-47s, his voice cut off mid-transmission. The memory flashed. Smoke trailing across the clouds, a parachute that never opened. He forced the thought away. "Quantity doesn't replace quality," he said finally, his tone clipped. But it sounded less convincing now, even to him. Becker nodded and left, leaving Weiss alone with the American machine and his unspoken thoughts. The night deepened, and the wind began to howl outside. The hangar lights flickered. Weiss lit another cigarette, staring at the nose of the Thunderbolt where the faded white star of the U.S. Air Force still clung to the metal like a ghostly emblem. He exhaled slowly, and for a fleeting moment he felt something strange. Respect, perhaps, or premonition. He tapped the fuselage lightly, whispering to himself, "We'll see how you fly when I meet you in the air." Then he laughed again. But this time, the laughter was quieter, lonelier, stripped of its earlier bravado. The next morning, the base awoke to the dull rumble of engines warming in the cold air. Orders had come. They were to intercept an incoming bomber formation. Weiss suited up, his leather gloves creaking as he tightened them. The mechanics saluted as he approached his Focke-Wulf, sleek and scarred from countless sorties. As he climbed in, he glanced once toward the hangar, where the captured Thunderbolt still stood under a top. A thought passed, unspoken, unwanted, that perhaps, just perhaps, this enemy machine deserved more than laughter. But he dismissed it with a shake of the head. Pride was armor, and he wore it well. The canopy closed with a heavy clunk, sealing him inside his world of sky and noise. Minutes later, the squadron roared into the heavens, slicing through clouds like steel daggers. The radio crackled with German voices, clipped and calm. Below, the world shrank into a patchwork of snow and fire. The war was entering its cruelest season, and though the men in the hangar still spoke of victory, somewhere, deep inside each of them, a quieter truth had begun to whisper, that laughter alone could not drown out the thunder that was coming. And in the frozen stillness of that empty hangar, the P-47 stood silent beneath its tarp, as if listening, waiting for the day when the laugh that had mocked it would echo again, not in triumph, but in realization. Weiss returned that evening with 2 kills claimed and 1 less comrade beside him. The laughter in the mess hall was muted now, replaced by exhaustion. He drank his schnapps slowly, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from something worse, understanding. The P-47 he had mocked was no joke in the sky. It dove faster than he expected, turned with surprising resilience, and its 8 machine guns spat fire with merciless precision. He remembered the glint of sunlight off its wings, the way it refused to fall even after smoke poured from its engine. A flying barn door, he had called it, yet in the cold reality of the air war, it had proven something else, that even the heavy can crush the proud. He said nothing of this to the others. He simply raised his glass in a quiet toast to absent friends and left before anyone could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. As the winter deepened and the skies grew bloodier, Weiss's laughter became rarer, but in that hangar, the echo of that first mocking laugh would linger, a haunting reminder of arrogance before understanding, of pride before truth. For in war, the loudest laugh often belongs to the one who hasn't yet met his reckoning. And though Weiss could not know it, that reckoning was already circling in the clouds above, waiting for the moment when the hunter would learn what it meant to be hunted. The winter sun rose weakly over the Ardennes, its pale light slicing through a veil of fog that clung stubbornly to the frozen earth below, where columns of smoke marked the scars of another night of Allied bombing. Inside the Luftwaffe airfield, Oberleutnant Karl Weiss stood in silence beside his Focke-Wulf 190, his gloved hand brushing frost off the canopy, eyes distant, haunted by the memory of the last mission, the moment he had seen a Thunderbolt dive through his formation like a falling anvil of death, its gun spitting fire, tearing through one of his wingmen before pulling away almost mockingly. That night he hadn't laughed, he hadn't spoken. He'd simply sat in his quarters staring at the ceiling, the echoes of his earlier arrogance replaying in his mind like a cruel joke. Now, as he gazed across the frozen runway, he wondered if fate had already chosen him for some lesson written in the clouds. "Fuel's low, sir," one of the mechanics said, snapping him out of thought. "Enough for 1 sortie, maybe 2 if you glide home." Weiss gave a small nod. "1 will be enough." He climbed into the cockpit, the familiar creak of leather and metal whispering like old friends. The smell of oil and cold steel filled his lungs, grounding him. Above the static chatter of the radio, the voice of Major Kruger came sharp and clipped. "Recon flight sector northwest. Reports of enemy fighters sweeping ahead of bombers. Move fast, Weiss." The engine growled to life beneath him, and as the hangar doors opened to the bitter air, he saw young Becker in the next aircraft over, giving a nervous thumbs up. Weiss returned the gesture, though his eyes were already fixed on the horizon, where he would finally meet the machine he had once mocked,
face to face. The formation lifted off in a staggered climb, engines howling as they pierced the cloud layer. The air was biting cold, the kind that numbed skin through even the thickest gloves. At 15,000 feet, the world below disappeared beneath a blanket of white, and the sky stretched endless and pale above. Weiss led the small group, 4 Focke-Wulfs against whatever waited beyond the horizon. For a long while, there was only the hum of engines and the whisper of wind through the cockpit seams. Then, at 10 o'clock high, movement, silver glints cutting through the sky like spears of light. "Contact!" Becker's voice crackled through the radio, taut with excitement and fear. Weiss squinted, adjusting his goggles. At first he thought they were Mustangs, sleek and slender, but as they drew closer, his stomach tightened. These were no Mustangs. The shapes were heavier, broader, the same broad wings and massive fuselage he had mocked days before. "Thunderbolts," he said under his breath, and for the first time in years the word carried no contempt, but a strange, grudging respect. The P-47s came in fast, sunlight flashing off their canopies like mirrors. They didn't maneuver like the British fighters he was used to. Instead, they held formation with almost mechanical precision, climbing higher even as the Germans approached. Weiss frowned. "They want the altitude advantage," he muttered. "They'll dive from above." His hand tightened around the stick. "Climb with me," he ordered, and the Focke-Wulfs clawed upward, engines straining against gravity. The Thunderbolts waited, patient, disciplined, until suddenly one broke formation and began its dive. Weiss saw it coming, the thick body of the P-47 cutting through the air with terrifying speed, its 8 machine guns flashing. Tracers whipped past his canopy, one grazing his left wing and tearing away a strip of metal. The sound was deafening, a hammering of death. "Brake! Brake!" he shouted, rolling hard to the right, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. Becker followed, but one of the others wasn't fast enough. His plane caught fire mid-roll, exploding into a burning star that vanished into the clouds below. The radio filled with static and screams. Weiss gritted his teeth, rage replacing fear. He looped hard, trying to catch the Thunderbolt as it pulled up from its dive, its engine roaring like a beast. He lined up his sights, fired a short burst, missed. The P-47 banked sharply, climbing again. It was slower to turn, just as he had expected, but its speed in the dive and its resilience were monstrous. He chased it, his propeller biting into the thin air. The 2 planes spiraled upward through the clouds, Weiss pushing his engine to the limit. "You're mine," he hissed. The Thunderbolt tried to roll out, but Weiss anticipated the move, firing again. This time, bullets struck, sparks flew off the American's wing, smoke trailing faintly. But it didn't go down. "Damn it," Weiss cursed, his disbelief mixed with admiration. The American pilot, whoever he was, didn't panic. Instead, the Thunderbolt flipped over and dove straight down again, using its weight and power like a sledgehammer against the sky. Weiss followed, feeling his stomach lurch as they plunged through the cloud cover, the altimeter spinning downward like madness. The air screamed past his canopy, his engine shaking from the strain. He realized too late that the Thunderbolt was outpacing him, not because of skill, but because of design. The heavy frame that had seemed ridiculous in the hangar was now the reason it could dive faster than anything else in the air. The German ace had mocked its size, but now that mass was its weapon. Weiss pulled out of the dive just in time, the wings of his Focke-Wulf groaning. The American leveled out below, disappearing into the mist. "Scheisse," he spat, climbing again, scanning the horizon. Becker's voice broke through the static. "Sir, behind you!" Weiss rolled instinctively, and a split second later, streams of tracers tore through where he'd been. A second Thunderbolt had slipped in unseen. "Smart," Weiss muttered, pulling a high G-turn to shake the pursuer. The 2 danced through the sky, twisting, rolling, each trying to outthink the other. The Thunderbolt's turning radius was wider, but its pilot compensated with patience and cunning, forcing Weiss to overshoot.
For minutes the duel continued, machine versus machine, man versus man. The sky became their arena, the clouds their audience. Every bullet, every maneuver, was a conversation between rivals who had never met, but understood each other through the language of flight and death. Then came the opening. Weiss saw the Thunderbolt pull too steeply into a climb, its speed bleeding off. He dove after it, lined up his sights, and fired. The round struck true, ripping into its tail. For a moment, the American fighter wobbled, smoke trailing from its rear. "Got you," Weiss whispered. But just as he was about to press his advantage, another P-47 appeared out of nowhere, diving at him from above. It was a trap. The first had baited him. The second fired, bullets slamming into his fuselage, shattering the canopy glass. Shards cut across Weiss's cheek, warm blood mixing with the cold air. Verdammte! He yanked the stick, barely avoiding a fatal hit. The world blurred, blue sky, white cloud, flashes of silver, until he managed to level out, breathing hard, his heart pounding like a drum. Through the cracked canopy, he saw the two Thunderbolts reforming below, flying together, disciplined, unstoppable. He felt an emotion he hadn't known since his earliest days as a cadet. Humility. These weren't just machines. These were predators in their own right. Weiss regrouped with Becker, the only other survivor of their flight. "They're good," Becker said, his voice trembling. "Better than we thought." Weiss didn't answer immediately. He was watching the horizon where the Thunderbolts vanished into sunlight, the same machines he had once laughed at. "They're not better," he said, finally, though his tone lacked conviction. "They're different, and that's what makes them dangerous." They limped home, their aircraft riddled with holes, their pride punctured even deeper. When they landed, the mechanics stared in silence, one plane missing, another barely holding together. Weiss stepped out, his face streaked with blood and oil, his flight jacket torn. He walked straight to the hangar where the captured Thunderbolt still stood, now half dismantled by engineers. He looked at it for a long moment, his reflection warped in its dented metal. "You fly like you're made of thunder itself," he whispered. The words were quiet, almost reverent. No one else heard. That night the base mess hall was silent except for the sound of cutlery and low murmurs. The men ate without laughter. Even Major Kruger seemed subdued. "You encountered Thunderbolts?" he asked, his tone cautious. Weiss nodded. He said, "They fly like tanks, but they fight like wolves. Always in pairs, always disciplined." Kruger frowned. "We can still outturn them." Weiss gave a faint smile. "Perhaps, but turning doesn't win wars anymore." The major didn't respond, and the room fell quiet again. Outside, the wind howled over the snowdrifts, rattling the hangar doors. The captured P-47 gleamed faintly under the floodlights, its shadow long and dark against the ground. Later, unable to sleep, Weiss walked back to the hangar alone. The night smelled of kerosene and cold metal. He touched the Thunderbolt's fuselage again, tracing the rivets, feeling the strength beneath the surface. He thought of the American pilot he had fought, faceless, unseen, but skilled beyond expectation. Somewhere out there, that man was likely cleaning his own plane, just as shaken, just as changed. War had a way of forcing respect between enemies who'd never spoken a word. Weiss sat on a nearby crate, lighting a cigarette, staring at the massive radial engine of the P-47. "You no-flying cow," he murmured, exhaling smoke into the still air. "You're the storm they named you after." He imagined the sound of those engines, deep, rolling, like distant thunder, and understood for the first time that the laughter he had given days ago was no different than the arrogance that had blinded so many before him. In the days that followed, Weiss's squadron received more reports, more Thunderbolts appearing across the front, escorting bombers, hunting German fighters. The sky, once their domain, was being claimed by new masters. The Luftwaffe pilots whispered about invincible planes that refused to fall even under direct fire. Some said they saw P-47s return to base with wings full of holes, still flying steady. Weiss said nothing. He had seen enough. When Becker asked him quietly one morning, "Do you still think they're just heavy cows, sir?" Weiss only smiled faintly, his eyes distant. "No," he said, "they're bulls, and bulls don't laugh." He flew again that afternoon, not out of duty, but to understand, to test his own limits against what he now respected. The air was colder, sharper, filled with the memory of loss. As he took off, the base shrank beneath him, and the sky opened like a silent arena once more. Somewhere ahead, he knew, the Thunderbolts would be waiting, and this time he would not underestimate them. For the first time in his career, Carl Weiss did not feel like the hunter. He felt like the student, flying toward the truth that had been staring at him from that hangar all along. And though he did not yet know it, this first encounter had changed everything: his pride, his purpose, his destiny. The laughter was gone now, replaced by the steady heartbeat of a man who had seen the face of the storm and chosen to fly into it again. The days that followed the first encounter bled into one another like streaks of gray smoke in a winter sky, each dawn arriving colder, quieter, and heavier than the last. The laughter that once filled the hangar had vanished, replaced by the drone of engines and the murmurs of tired men pretending they still believed in invincibility. Oberleutnant Carl Weiss moved through the airfield like a shadow now. The same sharp uniform, the same proud stride, but the spark behind his eyes had dimmed into something else: awareness. He had seen the Thunderbolt's power firsthand, and though he said little, it had left a mark deeper than shrapnel. Every time he passed the captured American fighter, now stripped open for study, its thick armor plates scattered like pieces of a riddle, he felt a strange pull, as though the machine itself was silently mocking him now, whispering back the very words he had thrown at it days ago. Too big to fight, too slow to run. Yet he had watched it climb through fire and dive through death, and the phrase now tasted like ash. His mechanics noticed the change, though none dared to speak of it. Weiss no longer joked during inspections. He no longer boasted in the mess. He flew with precision, not passion, and his landings were slower, his eyes scanning the horizon long after his wheels had touched the ground, as if expecting ghosts to follow him home. One evening, Becker approached him as they stood outside the barracks, breath misting in the cold air. "Sir," the young pilot said hesitantly, "do you think we can still win?" Weiss didn't answer at first. He stared at the faint glow of the setting sun over the ruined tree line, where distant artillery flashed like dying stars. "Winning," he said finally, his voice low, "is a word for men who still believe the war listens." Becker frowned, not fully understanding. "But we still have better pilots. We have you." Weiss gave a small, humorless laugh. "Better pilots mean nothing if we run out of sky." He walked away, leaving the younger man staring after him, unsettled. That night, the base came alive, with rumors, whispers of new Allied fighters crossing deeper into German airspace, of Thunderbolts attacking supply lines, strafing trains, cutting off reinforcements. The once proud Luftwaffe was bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Weiss listened to the chatter, his cigarette burning low, and thought of the faceless American pilot he had fought. Somewhere out there, that man was likely celebrating a victory Weiss could not deny. For the first time, he felt something he had never allowed himself to feel toward an enemy: envy. Not of power or machines, but of certainty. The Americans fought with the confidence of men who knew they had time, fuel, and numbers. Weiss and his men fought like gamblers, spending their last coin. A week later, the order came for another mission. Intelligence reported an Allied formation approaching from the west, bombers escorted by Thunderbolts. The hangar was a flurry of motion again, mechanics shouting, engines roaring, frost scraping from wings. Weiss watched his men prepare, sensing the unease beneath their silence. He climbed into his Focke-Wulf, the cockpit cold against his gloved hands. As the squadron lifted into the sky, he felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, but it was different now, no longer the thrill of a hunter, but the awareness of prey. The radio crackled with chatter, coordinates, confirmations, until the call came, "Contact! 11 o'clock high!" Weiss squinted into the sun and saw them, the silver phantoms returning, glinting like blades against the pale sky. Thunderbolts, again. The fight erupted like thunder rolling across clouds. The sky turned into chaos, streaks of smoke, flashes of gunfire, the distant rumble of bombs far below. Weiss banked hard, diving through a stream of tracer fire. He saw Becker trying to evade two thunderbolts that boxed him in. "Pull up! Pull up!" Weiss shouted, diving to intercept, but the boy's engine burst into flames before the words left his lips. The explosion painted the sky orange, fragments spinning like confetti of death. Weiss's heart pounded. He dived straight through the fireball, his canopy scorched, eyes burning from the heat. He caught sight of one of the thunderbolts climbing away, and something snapped. He pushed the throttle to the limit, chasing it, rage blotting out reason. "You think you're untouchable?" he snarled, pulling closer, the world narrowing to the crosshairs in front of him. He fired, a long, furious burst, and saw bullets tear into the American's fuselage. Smoke poured from its engine, but the Thunderbolt didn't fall. It kept flying, heavy, wounded, but alive. Weiss fired again. Nothing. The plane refused to die. It dove, vanishing into cloud, and Weiss followed, until the warning lights flashed on his own control panel, fuel dangerously low. He was forced to pull up, cursing, as the American disappeared into the mist, unbroken. He returned to base alone, his face pale, his hands trembling. No victory, no confirmation, just silence and the lingering scent of burned oil and loss. When he stepped from his aircraft, the mechanics said nothing. They didn't need to. His eyes told the story. A man who had looked into the storm and found no weakness. Later, in the mess hall, someone tried to lighten the mood with a joke about the flying tanks. Weiss didn't even look up. He simply muttered, "Tanks survive, pilots don't." The words chilled the room. From that day on, no one mocked the Thunderbolts again. Days passed, and the pattern repeated. Missions, losses, exhaustion. Weiss began keeping notes in a small leather journal, sketching the silhouettes of Allied aircraft, studying their movements, their attack patterns. It was less obsession than necessity. Knowledge was the only advantage left. He grew quieter, older in demeanor though his years had not changed. The other pilots whispered that he was cursed, that every man who flew beside him now failed to return. But Weiss didn't believe in curses. He believed in numbers, and the numbers no longer favored them. One cold morning he visited the hangar before dawn, drawn again to the dismantled Thunderbolt. The mechanics had removed the engine for study, leaving its hollow shell open like the carcass of some great animal. Weiss climbed into the cockpit, running his fingers along the control column, the throttle, the thick canopy glass. He sat there for a long time, imagining what it must feel like to fly one. The power, the stability, the sheer endurance. He could almost hear the deep growl of the radial engine, smell the cordite of its guns. A thought crossed his mind, strange and treacherous. If I had borne on the other side, would I be sitting here as the victor? He pushed it away, ashamed of it, but it lingered nonetheless. War had blurred the lines between pride and truth, between loyalty and survival. That evening, the airfield was bombed. Allied planes struck with brutal precision, flattening fuel depots and shredding hangars. Weiss barely escaped the blast, throwing himself into a trench as the sky rained fire. When the attack ended, the airfield was a graveyard of twisted metal. Among the ruins lay the captured Thunderbolt, now broken, its wings torn off, its fuselage split open by shrapnel. Weiss approached it through the smoke, his boots crunching over debris. He knelt beside it, brushing ash from the star insignia, still faintly visible on its side. "You outlasted us all," he whispered. It was not mockery this time, but mourning. Not for the machine, but for what it symbolized. The world was changing, and he could feel Germany collapsing beneath his feet. In the weeks that followed, Weiss flew fewer missions. Supplies dwindled, fuel rationed to near nothing. The once proud ace who had laughed at the enemy's fat airplane now found himself flying empty skies, hunting phantoms. The radio calls grew fewer, the camaraderie thinner. One by one, his comrades vanished, shot down, captured, lost to the cold. He began to dream of the Thunderbolt at night, not as an enemy, but as an inevitability. In those dreams, he saw it chasing him endlessly through gray clouds, guns silent, its engine humming like a heartbeat, patient and eternal. The day came when orders arrived to retreat. The airfield was to be abandoned. Weiss stood on the runway at dawn, the last of his squadron, watching the smoke of distant fires. He looked toward the horizon, where somewhere beyond the clouds, the P-47s still roamed, the same machines that had once made him laugh, then made him doubt, and now made him understand. War was not about who mocked first, but who endured last. He took a final walk through the wreckage of the hangar, pausing beside the ruined Thunderbolt. It lay silent, broken, yet even in defeat, it seemed to hold dignity. Weiss placed his gloved hand on the scorched metal and murmured, "You never were the joke, I was." Then he turned and walked away, his shadows stretching long across the floor. By nightfall, he caught sight of one Messerschmitt spiraling down in flames, then another bursting apart mid-air as a Thunderbolt passed through the wreckage, indifferent, unstoppable. Weiss gritted his teeth, rage mixing with disbelief. How could such a heavy, ungainly beast dominate the sky so completely? He turned sharply, finding a Thunderbolt alone at his 3 o'clock. He dove. The world narrowed to the gun sight, the steady crosshairs over the silver wing. He fired, a perfect burst. Smoke erupted from the enemy's right engine. The plane lurched. "Got you," Weiss whispered, watching it trail downward. But the Thunderbolt didn't fall. It kept flying, stubborn, the pilot fighting to stabilize it. Then, in a stunning maneuver, the American flipped the craft, dove beneath Weiss, and came up behind him. The sky turned white with panic as tracer rounds ripped past his cockpit. "Scheisse!" he gasped, diving again, twisting through cloud cover, heart hammering. The enemy followed. The air battle became a nightmare ballet of speed and instinct. Weiss rolling, dodging, cutting through vapor, trying to shake the hunter now at his back. Every move he'd ever mastered, every trick drilled into him through years of combat, he used. But the Thunderbolt was always there, heavy yet inexorable, like a force of nature. Then it came, one perfect burst from the P-47's 8 machine guns. Bullets slammed into Weiss's tail, shattering control surfaces. The plane pitched forward violently, alarmed screaming. He yanked the stick back, barely regaining control as smoke filled the cockpit. "Not yet," he hissed through gritted teeth, his face slick with sweat. He dove toward the trees, the freezing wind roaring past. The Thunderbolt didn't follow this time. It climbed, perhaps out of ammunition, perhaps out of pity. Weiss leveled out barely above the treetops, the earth a blur of white and shadow. He could see the burning wrecks of both German and American planes scattered across the Ardennes forest, testament to the fury of the skies that day. His squadron was gone. The radio was silent. Only the sound of his own labored breathing filled the cockpit now. For a long moment he flew without direction, just trying to keep the crippled aircraft aloft. Then, through the smoke and grief, he laughed, softly at first, then bitterly. The same laugh that once echoed in the hangar mocking the American machine now turned hollow in his throat. He realized, with cold clarity, that the war had outgrown men like him, that the days of the elegant dogfight, the romantic ace, were dying here in the snow. The Thunderbolt wasn't beautiful, it wasn't graceful, but it survived, it conquered, and that, he understood now, was all that mattered. His instruments flickered, warning lights blinking their final rhythm. Fuel was almost gone. Weiss turned his plane east, toward what he hoped was friendly territory. Below, the forest stretched endless and indifferent, while the sky behind him still burned with battle. He thought of his comrades, of laughter, of pride, of the hangar where it all began. And for the first time, he felt not shame, but surrender to the truth. The sky no longer belonged to them. With one last glance toward the fading light, Weiss whispered, "Thunderbolt," not in mockery, but in awe. Then, as his engine coughed and died, his plane dipped gently toward the snow-covered world below, the sound of war fading into the wind. The forest received him with silence and smoke, the broken skeleton of his B-109 lying half buried in snow and splintered pine. Weiss dragged himself from the wreckage, blood darkening his flight jacket, breath ragged against the freezing air. The engine still hissed, the smell of oil and burning metal lingering in the bitter wind. He stumbled through the snow, the pain in his leg sharp and deep, yet he refused to stop. Around him, the Ardennes was an echo chamber of distant thunder, artillery rolling from unseen lines, the drone of passing aircraft like ghosts of the battle still raging above. He limped toward a small ridge, every step crunching in the frost, his ears straining for any sound that wasn't death. "Keller! Schmidt!" He muttered their names through cracked lips, the names of his men, his comrades who had taken off beside him that morning. They had laughed before the flight, confident, almost careless. Keller, the joker, had bet a bottle of schnapps that he'd down 2 Thunderbolts before lunch. Schmidt, ever the realist, had only smiled, cleaning his goggles in silence. Now the sky was empty of their laughter. Only the broken pieces of their faith drifted in the wind. Weiss found the first wreck an hour later, smoke curling from the twisted frame of a Messerschmitt. The markings were clear: black cross, yellow nose, and Keller's personal emblem, a grinning wolf painted beneath the cockpit. The wolf's grin was now smeared with soot and blood. Weiss sank to his knees beside it, the heat from the wreck warming his face as the rest of him froze. Keller was still in the seat, slumped forward, his gloved hands rigid on the control column. His flight goggles were shattered, his face eerily calm beneath them, as if asleep in some cruel parody of rest. Weiss didn't speak. There were no words that fit inside the silence between death and disbelief. He simply reached forward, closing Keller's eyes with his blood-stained fingers, and whispered, "Ruhe in Frieden, Bruder." Then he stood again, his body heavy, his spirit heavier. The next wreck lay further east, down a slope littered with broken branches and burnt snow. Schmidt's 109 had hit hard, tearing through the trees before splitting apart. Weiss found what was left of him in the cockpit, his chest riddled with shrapnel. A photograph clutched in his hand. A woman, smiling, holding a small child. Weiss looked at it for a long time, unable to move. He thought of how Schmidt used to talk about the child, a daughter born just before the invasion of France. He had promised to come home for her first birthday. Now she would grow up never knowing the sound of his voice. The realization struck Weiss harder than the crash had. Around him, snow began to fall again, thick and silent, covering the wrecks, the bodies, the truth. The forest was burying them as even as it mourned. He stumbled away, feeling smaller with each step, his uniform heavy with grief. The Luftwaffe had once been a brotherhood of aces, men who believed the sky was their realm, their destiny. But here, in the dying days of winter, that illusion was breaking apart. The Americans had numbers, resources, power, and the Thunderbolt, that iron beast he had once mocked, now ruled the clouds with impunity. Weiss began to understand that bravery alone could not fight inevitability. When he finally reached a clearing, he saw a column of smoke in the distance, another crash, or perhaps a village. He moved toward it, every breath a fight against the cold, every memory cutting deeper. He thought of the hangar again, the laughter, the arrogance, the careless jokes about the flying refrigerator that would never match a German ace. He had laughed the loudest. But the laugh now haunted him like a ghost. He reached the edge of a clearing and saw what remained of a farmhouse, half destroyed by bombs. A group of soldiers, Wehrmacht infantry, weary and frostbitten, were gathered around a fire. They turned their rifles toward him at first, then lowered them when they saw the Luftwaffe insignia on his torn uniform. "Pilot?" one of them asked, voice hoarse. Weiss nodded, collapsing near the fire. They offered him a tin cup of something warm, coffee, perhaps, or what passed for it. The men were silent, their faces hollowed by exhaustion. One of them stared into the flames and said quietly, "We saw the battle. The sky burned for hours." Weiss said nothing. What could he say? That his men were gone? That the sky they'd trusted had betrayed them? He looked into the fire and saw Keller's grin, Schmidt's photograph, the glint of metal wings that no bullet could stop. "How many of us are left?" he finally asked. The soldier shrugged. "Not enough to win," he said flatly. That night, Weiss sat alone outside the farmhouse, the forest whispering in the dark. He looked up at the stars, where they shone cold and distant, and thought of how once, not long ago, he had felt like one of them, bright, untouchable, eternal. Now he was just another fading light in a sky too wide to remember him. The war would end soon, he could feel it. Not in victory or glory, but in exhaustion. He wondered if the Americans knew how it felt, to lose so much, to watch the world you believed in crumble around you. Perhaps they did not. Perhaps that is why they built planes like the Thunderbolt, not elegant, not noble, but unyielding. Machines that did not care for beauty, only survival. He envied them for that. As the wind picked up, Weiss wrapped his coat tighter and closed his eyes. The laughter in the hangar came back again, echoing in his mind, twisting into something else, a memory of pride, of ignorance, of youth that the war had stolen from all of them. He didn't sleep much that night, only watched the stars and listened to the sound of snow falling over graves he could never mark. When dawn came, pale and cold, he rose, shoulders squared, though his spirit was broken. There was still duty, still orders, still the ghost of a cause that demanded men like him keep fighting, even when everything was already lost. He turned toward the east, where the remnants of his airfield waited, and began to walk, the forest swallowing his footprints behind him. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he kept moving, not for victory, not for Germany, but for Keller, for Schmidt, and for the sky that once belonged to them all. The Thunderbolt passed overhead, victorious but not vengeful, disappearing into the clouds like a ghost. Weiss managed to force the canopy open just before impact, the freezing wind tearing at his face as he bailed out. His parachute opened with a crack, jerking him violently. Below, his plane hit the trees and exploded, a bloom of orange fire in the snow. He drifted down slowly, the battlefield beneath him both terrible and beautiful. For the second time in a month, he had fallen from the sky. But this time, something inside him had changed. The laughter from the hangar was gone forever, replaced by quiet understanding. The Thunderbolt was not his enemy. It was his teacher. It had stripped him of pride, of arrogance, and left him with truth. As his boots sank into the snow, Weiss looked up at the sky once more. Smoke trailed across the clouds where his plane had burned. But beyond that, the air was calm, endless, eternal. He removed his gloves, letting the cold bite into his skin, as if to remind himself he was still alive. In the distance, artillery rumbled, a reminder that the war still raged. But for Weiss, something had ended already. He turned toward the sound, limping forward, the snow swallowing his footsteps. Above him, a single contrail cut across the heavens, faint and silver, a thunderbolt, flying home. He was their leader, but he knew what leadership meant now, to guide them into the storm, knowing most would not return. As they climbed higher, he spotted them ahead, 4 P-47 Thunderbolts, silver and powerful, moving in perfect formation. He felt a strange calm. Fate, it seemed, had brought him back to the machine that had haunted his sleep for weeks. "Stay high! Follow my mark!" he ordered. The squadron tightened up, engines howling in harmony. Weiss dove, sun at his back, every nerve alive. The first burst from his guns tore through the clouds, tracers streaking toward the lead Thunderbolt. The American formation scattered immediately, each plane rolling away in practiced precision. One broke off, circling behind. Another climbed to gain height advantage. Weiss smiled grimly. They were skilled, no question, but skill alone could not erase instinct. He banked hard left, coming nose to nose with one of the P-47s. They fired simultaneously. The air between them shimmered with death. Bullets shredded through both clouds and courage. Weiss's rounds struck the Thunderbolt's left wing, smoke trailing, but the American didn't break. The sheer power of the P-47 kept it steady. Its return fire clipped Weiss's tail, sending vibrations through the cockpit. "Come, Shun!" he muttered, gripping tighter. He dove again, heart pounding. The two planes spiraled through the gray heavens, locked in a deadly dance of vengeance and pride. Down below, the Ardennes blurred beneath them, a tapestry of smoke and snow. Weiss pulled up sharply, his body pressed into the seat by gravity's grip. The 109 trembled, protesting the strain, but it obeyed. The Thunderbolt followed, its massive frame matching every move. Weiss could almost see the American pilot now through the canopy, a dark silhouette, calm, unflinching. For a fleeting instant their eyes met across the void of air and war. No hatred, no arrogance, only mutual recognition. Weiss fired again, short, controlled bursts, but the Thunderbolt just rolled enough for the tracers to pass beneath. Then, impossibly fast, it turned inside his maneuver, diving beneath his tail. Weiss cursed, pulling into a climb, the G-forces crushing his chest. The sky became a tunnel, sound fading, heart hammering in rhythm with the machine guns thundering behind him. One bullet grazed his wing root, another smashed through the canopy glass, cutting a thin line across his cheek. He barely felt it. The hunt consumed everything. "Verdammt, you won't have me," he whispered. He flipped the plane into an inverted roll, diving straight through a cloud bank, using the mist as cover. The Thunderbolt hesitated, then followed. Inside the cloud, everything disappeared. Sky, ground, direction. Only instinct remained. Weiss jerked the stick right, then down, then pulled up hard, bursting from the fog with sunlight burning across his canopy. For one brief, glorious moment, he was behind the Thunderbolt. "Jetzt!" he roared, firing both cannons. The rounds struck the enemy's fuselage, tearing chunks of metal free. Smoke gushed from its engine, black and violent. Weiss's pulse surged with raw triumph. He watched the Thunderbolt tumble, spinning helplessly downward. "Got you," he whispered, almost reverent. But as it fell, the Thunderbolt's pilot did the impossible. He leveled out, regained control, and turned sharply back toward Weiss. It was wounded, but alive. Weiss froze. The machine refused to die. The American came at him head-on, both planes screaming across the sky like two meteors about to collide. Weiss fired again, but his guns jammed, the sound cut short by a sickening click. He had no time to react. The Thunderbolt's rounds tore through his left wing, shredding it apart. The
The 109 lurched violently, alarms wailing. Weiss fought the controls, his body slamming against the harness as the plane tumbled toward the forest below. The horizon spun, a blur of white and gray. He tried to eject, but the canopy jammed. Smoke filled the cockpit, choking him. Then, silence.
The snow fell thick and unbroken for hours, a curtain of silence that seemed to erase the world. Weiss trudged through it aimlessly, his parachute discarded somewhere behind him, the white expanse stretching endlessly in every direction. The crash still echoed in his bones. Every step hurt, his ribs ached, his ankle burned, and the cold crept into him like a slow, merciless poison. The forest around him was lifeless. No birds, no movement, just the whisper of wind against the trees. He followed the faint trace of smoke on the horizon, hoping for shelter, or perhaps fate. As dusk began to fall, he reached the edge of a clearing and froze. There, half hidden by snow, were the remains of an American encampment, tents abandoned in haste, tracks in the slush, a burnt-out jeep. He hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. His uniform, torn and blood-stained, still bore the Luftwaffe insignia, a death sentence if the wrong eyes saw it. But he needed warmth. He approached the nearest tent and ducked inside. The interior was empty, save for a half-burnt candle and a metal canteen of frozen water. He sat on the floor, hands trembling as he tried to thaw his fingers near the dying flame. For the first time since the war began, he felt utterly alone, not as an enemy pilot or a soldier, but as a man stripped of purpose. The laughter from the hangar, the roar of engines, the voices of his comrades, all were gone. Only silence remained. He didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. "Hands up, Kraut." The voice was rough, accented with the drawl of the American Midwest. Weiss slowly raised his hands, turning his head to see 2 U.S. soldiers at the entrance, both young, their rifles steady, eyes sharp. The taller one stepped forward, scanning him quickly. "Pilot, huh?" he said, noting the insignia. "You're a long way from your bird." Weiss didn't answer. His English was passable, but pride kept him silent. The other soldier approached, patting him down, retrieving a small Luger from his belt. "Not much of a threat now, are ya?" They motioned him outside, where an American half-track sat idling nearby, its lights dimmed for concealment. "Let's take him to HQ. Maybe he knows something." Weiss was shoved into the back, the metal cold against his bruised spine. The engine started, and they rolled through the forest, the rumble of treads blending with the muffled rhythm of distant artillery. He stared at the soldiers opposite him, boys really, faces barely old enough to shave. One chewed gum, the other cleaned his rifle with habitual precision. Neither looked at him with hatred, only weary detachment. To them he was just another prisoner in a war full of them. Somewhere deep down, Weiss felt a strange sense of relief. The fighting was over, at least for him. Hours later he arrived at a small American command post, set up in a captured farmhouse. He was led inside, where a stove burned and the smell of coffee filled the air. The warmth hit him like a memory of another life. An officer in a brown leather jacket looked up from a map spread across the table. "Who's this?" he asked without looking directly at Weiss. "German pilot, sir, crashed somewhere east of Bastogne." The officer nodded, taking a drag from his cigarette before finally turning to face him. "Name?" Weiss hesitated. "Oberlieutenant Heinrich Weiss," he said quietly. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Well, Lieutenant Weiss, you've been giving our boys quite a show up there. Heard there's a German ace matching your description who's been down twice in a month." Weiss said nothing, his jaw tightening. The officer smirked slightly, not out of mockery, but curiosity. "You speak English pretty well. You learned that in school or just from shooting at us?" Weiss met his gaze. "I learned it before the war, from books, not from killing." The room went quiet for a moment. Then the officer gestured for him to sit. "You're not in bad shape, considering. We'll get you patched up, then you can tell us what's left of your Luftwaffe." "Deal?" Weiss didn't reply, but exhaustion forced him into the chair. A medic cleaned his wounds in silence, wrapping his leg and bandaging the cut on his face. The sting of antiseptic was almost comforting. It reminded him he was still human. Later, they gave him a blanket, some bread, and a cup of thin coffee. He sat near the stove, staring into the fire. The officer approached again, leaning against the wall. "You know," he said, almost conversationally, "those P-47s you've been tangling with? The boys flying them talk about you, the German who dives into hell just to prove a point." Weiss looked up sharply. "They talk about me?" "Oh yeah," the officer chuckled. "One of our pilots swears you hit him so hard he thought his plane was splitting in two. Said you were the best stick he'd ever seen, enemy or not." Weiss felt something twist inside his chest. Respect from the other side. It was both humbling and unbearable. "He was good," Weiss said softly. "Too good. He could have killed me. He didn't." The officer nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's Captain Miller. He said the same about you." Weiss stared into the flames again. The fire cracked softly, and for a brief, surreal moment, it felt as if the war existed only far away on another planet. The officer sighed. "You know, Lieutenant, the war's just about done. You're lucky you're here and not buried under your plane." Weiss looked at him, eyes distant. "Luck," he repeated, tasting the word like ash. "I don't know that word anymore." That night, he was placed in a makeshift cell in the barn behind the farmhouse. The door was wooden, unbarred. There was nowhere to run. Through a gap in the planks he could see the moonlight spill over the snow, the same light that once guided him through the clouds. He thought of Keller and Schmidt again, of the men who'd followed him into battle believing they were gods of the air. He thought of the Thunderbolt that had spared him, the silent truce between two dying warriors. His pride, once so sharp, now felt meaningless. He was not a hero, not an ace, just another man caught in the storm's eye. Sometime before dawn, he heard footsteps. The door creaked open, and the officer entered holding 2 tin mugs. "Couldn't sleep," he said simply, handing Weiss one. It was coffee, hot, real coffee. Weiss accepted it without words. For a few minutes, neither spoke. The officer finally said, "You know, my brother flew P-47s before he was shot down over France. We never found him. I used to hate your kind for that." Weiss met his gaze evenly. "And now?" The officer looked into the darkness. "Now I just hate the war." They sat in silence after that, 2 soldiers from opposite sides, bound by the same fatigue. When morning came, the world outside was blinding white, pure and indifferent. The officer stood and nodded once. "We'll move you tomorrow. England, maybe. Until then, get some rest." Weiss watched him leave, then looked once more through the gap in the wood at the sky. He whispered something in German, too soft for anyone to hear. It wasn't a prayer or a curse. It was a farewell to the sky, to his comrades, to the man he used to be. The war had taken everything but his understanding. And in that understanding, he finally found peace. The morning came cold and colorless, a pale mist settling over the Ardennes as the distant echo of artillery faded into the horizon, replaced by the caw of crows and the crunch of boots on snow. Weiss awoke to the sound of movement outside the barn, jeeps starting, orders shouted, engines growling as men prepared to move out. He sat up slowly, every joint aching, his breath misting in the frigid air. His captors had been fair, almost gentle, and yet every kindness felt like a blade turned inward, cutting through what little remained of his pride. The door creaked open, and the American officer, Captain Morgan, entered, his face half-shadowed by the rising sun. "Morning, Lieutenant," he said evenly. "We're moving out soon. Command wants you transferred to a field interrogation unit near Liège." Weiss nodded, his expression unreadable. Morgan hesitated for a moment, then added, "There's something I think you should see before we go." He gestured for Weiss to follow. Outside, soldiers moved briskly through the snow, loading crates, checking weapons, speaking in clipped tones. At the far end of the clearing sat a line of parked aircraft, Thunderbolts, some scarred from combat, others newly arrived, their engines idling with deep, powerful hums that seemed to vibrate in Weiss's bones. He froze, eyes widening slightly. Morgan noticed and gave a small nod. "One of them's yours," he said quietly. "The man who shot you down landed here last night, said his engine was hit, had to put down. He heard we had a German pilot in custody and wanted to see you." Weiss turned slowly, his pulse quickening, and there, leaning against the wing of a P-47 painted with a bold red nose, stood an American pilot, tall, broad-shouldered, his flight jacket worn and streaked with oil. He looked up as Weiss approached, his eyes hidden behind goggles pushed to his forehead, revealing a face both hardened and strangely kind. "You're the guy they call the Black Eagle, right?" the American said with a faint smile. "The one who tore up half my squadron last month?" Weiss stopped a few meters away, stiff-backed, wary. "And you must be the man who burned my tail and sent me into the snow," he replied, his voice calm but edged. The American chuckled softly. "Guess that makes us even." For a long moment, they just studied each other. Two men from opposite sides of a dying war, bound by the same sky and the same silent respect. Morgan lingered nearby, watching but not interfering. The American extended a hand. "Captain Robert Miller, 56th Fighter Group, 9th Air Force." Weiss hesitated, then shook it, his gloved fingers cold and stiff. "Oberleutnant Heinrich Weiss, JG-27." Miller nodded slowly. "Hell of a fight we had up there. Never seen a 109 move like that. You flew her like she was part of you." Weiss allowed a flicker of a smile. "And your Thunderbolt?" He paused, searching for the right word. "It was not what I expected." Miller smirked. "Yeah, she's a big girl. Looks like a cow, flies like a hammer. But she takes punishment like nothing else in the sky." Weiss looked at the machine beside them, its fuselage marked with bullet holes, patched over with dull gray metal. "I used to laugh at them," he admitted. "We all did. Too heavy, too slow, we said. The Americans build tractors, not fighters." Miller laughed quietly. "Well, this tractor chased your Messerschmitt halfway to the clouds." Weiss's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful silence. "Yes," he said finally, "the Thunderbolt, it's not about speed, it's not about elegance, it survives, it endures. That's the real strength, isn't it? Not how fast you kill, but how long you can stay alive." Miller nodded, his face suddenly serious. "That's what we learned too. I lost 5 friends before I understood that. The 47's ugly, but she'll bring you home. That's all that matters now." Weiss looked at the man before him, and for the first time he saw not an enemy, but a reflection, another pilot haunted by the same ghosts, flying through the same endless storm. "You spared me," Weiss said quietly. Miller puzzled. "Spared you?" "During our fight, you had the shot. My engine was gone, I was finished, but you didn't fire again." Miller shrugged. "You were already going down. No need to kill a man who's beaten." Weiss's jaw tightened, his gaze distant. "You could have. Many would have." The American sighed, glancing towards the horizon. "Maybe I just got tired of watching people burn." The two men stood in silence, the sound of the engines filling the air like the heartbeat of some slumbering giant. Morgan finally spoke. "We're leaving soon, Captain. You coming with us?" Miller shook his head. "No, I'm heading back to base. Got orders to escort a bomber wing tomorrow." He turned back to Weiss and extended his hand again. "If we'd meant anywhere else, maybe we'd have shared a drink instead of bullets." Weiss clasped it firmly. "Perhaps in another life." Miller nodded once, then turned and climbed into his cockpit. The engine roared to life, snow swirling in spirals as the Thunderbolt taxied towards the field's edge. Weiss watched as it lifted gracefully into the air, climbing into the clouds like a bird returning home. For a long time after it vanished, he stood there, motionless. Morgan approached slowly. "Are you all right?" Weiss didn't look at him. "Now I understand," he murmured. "All those times we called them fools, the Americans, their machines, their methods, but they were fighting a different kind of war. One built not on pride or perfection, but on persistence. We thought skill would win. They knew endurance would." Morgan studied him carefully. "You're not the same man who walked into that hangar, are you?" Weiss gave a faint, almost broken smile. "No. That man died up there, somewhere above the Ardennes." They walked back towards the farmhouse, the snow beginning to fall again, gentle as ash. The camp was being dismantled, soldiers mounting vehicles, equipment loaded in neat mechanical rhythm. Weiss was led back to the half-track, his wrists lightly bound this time, not out of cruelty but protocol. As they started to move, he looked out the back, watching the airfield fade behind him. Somewhere high above, he imagined Miller's Thunderbolt, cutting through the clouds, engine roaring with that same indomitable defiance. The truth of the war, he realized, was not in victory or defeat, but in what survived the fire. Machines, men, even enemies, they were all fragments of the same story. In the distance, the horizon burned orange with another battle, another day of senseless struggle. But for the first time since the war began, Heinrich Weiss felt something close to peace. The laughter from the hangar no longer haunted him. It was a relic, a ghost of arrogance that had no place in this world anymore. The sky had taught him humility, and the enemy had shown him humanity. As the convoy rumbled on through the frozen landscape, Weiss closed his eyes, feeling the rhythm of the engine beneath him. It was the same deep, resonant hum as the Thunderbolts, the sound of survival. He smiled faintly to himself, a soldier finally stripped of illusion. The truth about the Thunderbolt was not that it was faster or stronger or better, it was that it refused to die. And perhaps, he thought, that was the only truth worth believing in.